So what you're watching right now is a tier 103 pit clear on the new and improved Blight Necromancer. The gear requirements for this are definitely going to push you to the limits a little bit because it gets pretty heavy-handed with the type of stats that we're looking for. But I actually want to start off this build guide video a little bit differently than I normally would, and I want to introduce y'all to Seroc if you've never met the guy. Seroc is one of the Necromancer guide writers over here on Wowhead. He started off in the Sanctuary Discord, and we started collaborating, I don't know, sometime around season 1, when it turned out that all the Necromancers kind of needed to band together and start sharing information because the class was ridiculously broken. And basically what he's been sending off to me in DMs is like, hey, have you tried just full committing to just Blight damage, ignoring Black River and ignoring Corpse Explosion, and seeing what happens? So again, shoutouts to him. He definitely kickstarted my reinvestigation of Blight and how to optimize it. But we are adding a new little bit of tech that you might have seen in a recent video of mine to be able to bring it even further. So again, shoutouts to Seroc, go give him some love. He's a really smart dude, and he's always just sending me the most wild stuff, and he's like, look at this, and I go, well, that's crazy. How do we make it better? But again, shoutouts to Seroc. But the tech in question, before I go over the differences between Blight as it was and Blight as it's going to be now in a fully optimized form, is going to be the addition of the damage affix. That's right, little old, non-niche, low roll, plain damage affix. Because if you haven't seen my most recent video, which I will go ahead and tag right here because you absolutely should, it turns out that that damage is double effective on damage over time spells. That means Blight, Blighted Corpse Explosion, Shadow Blood Wave, etc. So you actually get double the bonus of this in your additive damage bucket. And while we typically already added like over 1,000 additive damage to our damage bucket, this addition to it, and the fact that you can put 2 damage rolls onto a weapon, you can roll a damage and it's actually higher than any other damage temper that you can get on your gear, including your rings, your gloves, and your weapons, really pushes this thing to its utmost limit of what its DPS output is capable of. So I'm going to go ahead and include timestamps down to everything below. I'm going to start off just by kind of explaining the general approach to this version of the build, because I think that there are some things that people just really need to be aware of. And I want to be showing more of this pit clear just because it was just like kind of easy. We kind of just walked through it. We didn't have to try that hard. And the fight was also surprisingly easy. And I definitely think that this thing right now in its current iteration, even without getting better gear, probably going to push 105, maybe like 108. And then I'm going to have to start really masterworking to keep pushing beyond that. But let's go ahead and get into the differences. In the previous Blight iteration, we were using Black River and Sacrilegious Soul to be able to cast really powerful corpse explosions basically for free. All you had to do was hold down the Blight button and the Black River would do it for you. And that's perfectly fine. And honestly, it does a decent amount of damage. But just looking at what I currently am doing versus what I was doing on that build where I had double Masterwork crit on both my Sacrilegious Soul and my Black River, we have increased our DPS output by like 50 to 70%. That's how ridiculous of a change this is. Back on that setup, we were probably maxing out around 80 million to 100 million DPS if you count each tick, and there's 2 ticks per second, and you manage to actually crit on the Wither effect and get that basically more than double damage out of it. On the setup that you're currently looking here, while we were looking at different instances against bosses with like optimal setups, etc., and basically having all of our buffs available, we are easily cracking into the 200 million damage range, and this build has a significantly higher cap to what it can get to, because I'm actually playing it a lot more defensively and safely than what you could be doing right now. So let's go ahead and start in the skill tree just as a very quick overview. If you already understand the stats or if you're just going to use a planner, feel free to skip ahead because I do think explaining the gear is going to be a lot more important than this. But we need the 2 points for a generator. We are maxing out Blight. We're going to be putting all the points into Imperfectly Balanced and then Hued Flesh as well. Coming down to the next tier, because I very specifically have Shaco, I can not put any points into Blood Mist, although I think I want to put the 3 points in just to be able to get that corpse production. You would take the points out of Reaper's Pursuit to be able to do this. We're only putting the single point into Corpse Explosion because again, we don't care about its damage. We really just care about proccing Flesh Eater as well as Fueled by Death to have on-demand damage multipliers. Down into Decrepify, if I could, I would be maxing this out. We just don't have the points. Picking up Abhorrent Decrepify, Amplify Damage, and then Death's Embrace. Moving down just a single point into Corpse Tendrils, and then Vulnerable from Corpse Tendrils as well. We are putting 3 points into Necrotic Carapace. You don't necessarily need this, but I was looking to add on more survivability since we're pushing into greater than tier 100 pit, and it turns out monsters really hurt at this point. We do have the 3 points into Reaper's Pursuit. I don't really think that this is necessary, but I figured getting more mobility on the build wouldn't feel terrible. In fact, I'm just going to go ahead and proactively put those into Decrepify. The 1 point into Crippling Darkness just to be able to trigger the stun, and then obviously maxing out Gloom as well as Terror. Coming down to our last points here, remember that for Bone Storm and the damage reduction, you actually don't need the crit chance from this. We don't care about critting at all, so don't waste the point here. You can also get the 3 points into Standalone for that huge increase of damage reduction, and then into Memento Mori to be able to increase your sacrifice bonuses. And then obviously we're going to pick up Shadow Blight. Now that we went through the skill tree, let's talk about the gear and the aspects so you have a better idea of how this all works together. The primary goal of your gear is to stack these stats as high as you possibly can already. It is essence per second, essence cost reduction, attack speed, intelligence, and then as many rolls of damage as you can put onto your build, and I mean generic damage. And then other than that, we're going to add in some utility as well as survivability so that we're not just being pushed over immediately by every single monster engagement. Like I said, I'm using Shaco. You actually don't need Shaco. And in fact, a regular legendary helm with a greater affix of intelligence would be a significantly higher source of damage. And then on top of that, you would either want maximum life, cooldown reduction, as well as ranks to decrepify, which I actually think is pretty good, or you could fit your armor on that gear piece. And then that would allow you to either put another mobility aspect because we don't have room for void anywhere else, or you could even put something like explosive mist, which is I think something that I'm very interested in testing out because I'm currently using an aspect I absolutely hate, mostly because I don't like clicking corpse explosion on the build manually. Into the armor, you want intelligence, maximum life, and then essence per second here. You should never use the corpse tendrils duration affix from the temper kit. I recently found out that a lot of people were complaining of the fact that their corpse tendrils seem to have a lag, meaning that corpse tendrils would come down and then wouldn't pull in monsters immediately. And it's because of this temper affix right here. You do not want this thing. Also, I am currently being raided by Woodijo, so I'm just going to say hi very quickly. Hey, Woody. Thank you for the raid. We're recording a YouTube video. Welcome in, everybody. This is the Better Blight. Back to YouTube. We would either want decrepify size or corpse tendrils size here because we do like that just like added utility of it. Or if you just want to go full bore on being able to stagger bosses as fast as possible, you can always go with lucky hit chance to be able to apply freeze or immobilize. Try to avoid slow because we already get a ton of that from our build. Here's where you're going to be putting Hardened Bones. I cannot for the life of me find a perfect roll on Hardened Bones. If you have one, just like sound off down in the comments, mostly so I can be jealous and yell at you, but I would love to get a perfect roll on this. I've salvaged so much gear. I don't know how I haven't found one yet. For the gloves, this one's a little bit interesting. So obviously intelligence and attack speed, I would still want ranks to Blight. The vast majority of your damage is coming from Ebon Piercer. That being said, ranks to Blight is going to increase the base missile damage as well, especially if you're attacking while moving and avoiding pit boss mechanics. So I don't think that you should sleep on having ranks to Blight here. I just got a roll of damage over time. You can't actually get generic damage on the affix roll for gloves, so shadow damage over time or damage over time is going to be your best option. Then for tempering, again, generic damage. And then here I'm applying freeze, which is really nice because it's going to like chill and then freeze targets, and it gives us a really powerful tool for staggering bosses. And then here's where you're going to put ultimate shadow to make sure that this is a darkness skill, and it can help you to trigger Shadow Blight more often, and also generate a ton of barrier, which you can actually use to survive the primary boss's attacks pretty efficiently as long as you have enough maximum life to back it up. For the pants, just intelligence, maximum life. Here's where I kind of dump all of my armor requirements. So as long as you get a good armor roll and then a good total armor roll, then you don't really need to worry about getting any more armor on your kit to be able to reach the 9,230 mark. Here, I do have a greater affix roll. You would just need to be able to swap out one of your gems in your rings for a skull to be able to make up the difference. And then again, either corpse tendril size or decrepify size or another stagger mechanic. And this is where you're putting shielding storm for your barrier gen. For the boots, intelligence, movement speed, essence per second, chance to immobilize, and more movement speed. And this is where I'm putting void. Again, if you are using a legendary helmet, you would put a mobility aspect here. Either Slaughter or Ghostwalker are both really good options. But here's where I can currently fit it on. Do not sleep on using void. Basically, being able to engage combat with void before a corpse has been produced has been pivotal in being able to navigate the actual pit itself without running into really dicey situations where not everything is off of cooldown yet. For the amulet, obviously we're using Ebon Piercer. The most important stat on this is the actual damage over time, the flat damage value of the aspect itself. Even if I had a 4 greater affix Ebon Piercer, even if that didn't say like, if it said 28,000 damage, I would not use it. That's how important that stat is. For the rings, this is where we're going to be filling in a lot of the niche stats that we need. You basically want intelligence, attack speed, and resource cost reduction. Then you also want a single roll of lucky hit chance to be able to apply vulnerable, because just with corpse tendrils, you don't maintain 100% uptime on vulnerable, and it is a very large increase of our overall damage that you don't want to miss out on. But the intelligence roll and the attack speed roll are super important. And then the tempers for resource cost reduction is what's going to allow you to actually spam cast Blight at the same rate that I am. So make sure to prioritize that. I currently have a second roll of it on my affixes itself, and I've actually double masterwork crit on it, and it feels incredibly powerful. You also want to be tempering on, again, generic damage. Do not sleep on generic damage. It's the whole point of this build being as strong as it is. The generic damage, if you do get like damage to close, damage to crowd control targets, it's not terrible. Obviously, crowd control will only work once the boss is staggered, but it will work on all the minions leading up to it in the pit. But you want that plain damage roll. Even shadow damage over time, again, isn't terrible. It's just not as strong. This is where you're going to be putting your damned aspect. And then I went with Ozius Gale. I really hate clicking Corpse Explosion, and this just helps us to eat corpses proactively. Also gives us better uptime on Bone Storm, which isn't the most important thing, but it can feel nice depending on how long a particular fight drags out, depending on your own DPS. So it's not the worst thing. I would much prefer to be using Conceited for another 25% damage multi, because you should have basically 100% uptime on Bone Storm, and then you can always rely on having that barrier. So that's obviously going to be really important, and a significantly higher DPS output. I'm just kind of playing around with it because I'm very, very lazy, and I don't want to have to fight that hard to be able to do this content, if I'm being honest with you. You'll also get a metric ton of intelligence here that after masterworking will get higher and higher. I personally re-rolled to a maximum life roll because I just found that I was a little bit too squishy once we broke over the tier 100 boundary. If I can just get better, or maybe get a couple more masterworks on my gear, or a couple more greater affix life rolls on my gear, you wouldn't need it here. And then what you would want to do is get the generic damage roll and shadow damage over time roll. They will both add up to a whopping 120 total additive damage. So that'll be 240 just from those. And then you want to temper on another damage roll. And then on top of that, chance for Blight to cast twice. The more often that Blight casts twice, the more often that you're going to be stacking your Blight damage, right? That makes sense. Double the Blight, double the damage. It is incredibly strong if you are still scaling the Blight's damage, which I think that you should be. There is a universe where you basically like don't care about anything other than the bolts from Ebon Piercer, and then you don't care about this, but there's basically not a better temper to put on anyways. So we're going to ignore that potential for right now and just move on. You are going to be putting in the damage over time gems here. If you could have 100% uptime on vulnerable, that would be strictly more beneficial than that. And then this is where we're going to put blighted for the 240% damage multi. It's absolutely insane. You have it up 100% of the time, especially once you pop Bone Storm. It's just phenomenal. For the Book of the Dead, obviously we're going to be sacrificing Reapers for the damage multi, Cold Mages for the damage multi, and then here's where you have a couple different options. Once we actually know all of the attack speed breakpoints, I'll be able to tell you whether or not you need to use Bone Golem's 10% increased attack speed to reach it. Until then, I currently only have 24,000 life, but when I sacrifice my Blood Golem, I have 27,000 life, which is another 3,000 barrier from Shielding Storm. So another 6,000 life for clicking that one button is like pretty primo tops, and I would highly recommend going with this if you ever feel squishy at any point. Luckily for people playing the build at home right now, nothing really changes in the Paragon board. I did make one little alteration, but I'll just very quickly go through this. Please use the build planner down in the link below so that you don't have to listen to me ramble if you don't want to. But in the starter board, we are using Amplify for the 1.1 multi. Remember that since generic damage is double effective, this is actually representative of 21.4 damage. So adding on additional damage nodes here are actually very efficient per Paragon point. There aren't a ton of places to do this in your Paragon, so you basically just have to worry about picking up here, but that's why we are all of a sudden. Into the Witherboard, we're going to path out to the left using Abyssal. Then we're going to move into our Bone Graft board. That's to be able to pick up Tenacity and a huge amount of maximum life here. So we're putting Scourge for another 1.1 multi and a little bit of shadow damage over time, picking up Res to be capped. Moving up into Flesh Eater, this is where we're putting Sacrificial, another 1.1 multi, and then this will also increase our damage to elites. Building down to Flesh Eater, which is obviously a huge multiplier for the build, and then we build over here into Bloodbath. Bloodbath, because one, we're going to put Control here. The moment that we stagger a boss, it gets us a 1.2 multi, and the moment that you cast Decrepify, it applies a 1.2 multi as well, a bunch of damage to crowd control. But the reason why we're building over to here very specifically is for the maximum life and then the damage taken over time reduction. This is helping me to survive things like poison effects and bleed effects, stuff like that. Just a huge amount of damage reduction to very specifically that source of damage, which tends to be like one of the biggest issues for a build to deal with. Building back down into Wither to be able to efficiently pass by both the damage reduction to shadow damage over time. So this is 14% damage reduction right here, then even more maximum life and restorative. Obviously we're picking up Wither. My Wither has a 42% chance to proc and increases our damage by 2.98. That is per each instance of damage over time on the target. Each one rolls independently. But you'll notice I'm sitting on a whopping 2200 intelligence. This is without greater affix intelligence in all of my gear pieces, without a helmet with intelligence, so we can get significantly more onto the build. But the higher you get this, the stronger that Wither becomes. That's why it's so important to be able to reach really high values with this. And then lastly, building over into Sent to Death, pick up the additional damage here from Shadow Resilience. And then this is where we're putting Exploit. I previously had Territorial for the damage reduction. Forget that. We go with Exploit. Technically speaking, if you were to remove a bunch of the maximum life rolls, and especially kind of this pathway through Bloodbath, you could reach out to one more glyph and be able to activate Gravekeeper. Gravekeeper, and let me just show it to you real quick. Boop, boop, boop. Where is it? Hello? Gravekeeper, I believe in you. Did I not even level it? Here we go. Gravekeeper is going to say, let me just turn, that you're going to deal increased damage per corpse near you. So once you have 6 corpses on the ground, you get a 1.12 multi. It'll also increase rare nodes, so that can increase the plain damage roll from the starter board if you really wanted to do that. But there we go. I literally just took the gear that would allow me to temper on the stats that I need. I went and ran a couple tier 66s just to be able to masterwork it up to tier 1 and tier 2. You notice that these are all still on tier 1 with 1 crit. These ones have tier 2. This one doesn't even have a tier 2 crit on it yet. And the build took me from 97, which was the thing I ran and had to try really, really hard to be able to complete. And now we just did a 103 fairly easily, like very little sweat on the brow, even though it's disgustingly hot here in Boston right now. I'm really excited with the fact that there's even more optimizing to do on the build. Again, shout outs to Seroc for saying like, hey man, have you tried this? It's real good. And I appreciate that people are always willing to share what they're coming across. But I do think that this additional tech with the flat or the generic damage roll here really adds a ton onto the build. So that's really nice to be able to push it even further. But let me know what you think down in the comments. Have you been struggling on Blight? Were you looking to get more damage out of it? Are you willing to try something like this? Yeah, it's going to cost you a little bit to respec up into it because you're going to need to go get a really nice two-handed weapon. But once you do, you really feel the damage increase, and I'd love to hear from your experiences down below. Once I have this completely fine-tuned, I will be swapping over the endgame optimized boards and setup on Maxroll to this one, and then I'll probably leave the Black River version over onto it as more of like a speed farming or easier to achieve build, maybe, just for people who are looking for something where the gear is not necessarily as required to be able to perform really well, especially around like tier 80 in the pit. But I'd love to hear from you. Thank you so much for watching the video. If you're new here, consider subscribing to the channel. You might have seen a ton of this showing up in your algorithm recently and never even realized you weren't subscribed, so I'd really appreciate it. Toss a like onto the video if you wouldn't mind it. But as always, thank you so much for watching this video. I truly, truly hope that it helps you, and I look forward to seeing you in the next one.